We're going to cover the key points of the FSMA produce safety rule. We're going to discuss the importance of food safety, regulations and certifications, the basics, and water testing. Foodborne illness, each year the CDC estimates 1 in 6. The thing to really think about here is this is highly underreported. Outbreaks continue to occur, and it affects consumer confidence. The populations most vulnerable to foodborne illness are the young, elderly, pregnant, and the sick. This is a nice visual to show that every commodity is susceptible to pathogen contamination on the farm. You will see that sprouts and leafy greens are, the primary culprits. Part of that is sprouts, the environment in which they're grown. It's just a perfect breeding ground once you get a contaminant to kind of grow out of control. Leafy greens, the issue more there is, especially we get such a high yield from the southwest of the US, they overhead irrigate with a lot of canal water, which can then lead to a lot of problems because of the characteristics of leafy greens in the fields. So it's just stuff to think about when you're growing produce. The certifications and regulations. First, we'll talk about the difference between GAP, being GAP certified, and its relation to FSMA. So when you hear farms and growers reference GAPs and good agricultural practices, that's just how they're raising produce. A GAP certification, which is also known as an audit, is typically required by a third party. It is not a regulatory requirement. It is market driven, and it's administered by USDA or third parties. You've probably heard of Global GAP, Primus, SQF, various others. Whereas the FSMA produce safety rule, this is the first ever government regulation for the production, harvest, and handling of fruits and vegetables. Farms covered under the rule are subject to inspection. The final rule was released in 2015. It's had a gradual rollout since then, and the focus is on prevention of contamination. Who is covered? So if you're doing less than $25,000 a year in produce sales, it's a 3-year average, you are not covered under the rule. The easy way to think of produce without getting into the weeds is if you can pluck it in the field and eat it raw, generally it's going to be covered. If it's rarely consumed raw, so this is the pumpkins, for instance, that is not covered under the rule. If it's going to be commercially processed before consumption, tomatoes sold to a canner, for instance, that is also not covered under the rule. Qualified exemptions are a little more complicated. It has to do with food sales and who you're selling them to. And then everyone else is covered. There's no exemption if you're linked to a foodborne disease outbreak. If you're curious about this and want to go into details on your farm, you're on the Kansas side, just give me a call. If you're on the Missouri side, Patrick Byers is going to be your person. And at the end of the presentation, I'll have both of our contact informations up. Produce safety training requirements. Everyone covered will need to go to an approved training. This is regardless if you're GAP certified, have attended this training, have other certifications, etc. After that, there are annual food safety training requirements for workers, and there's an annual food training requirement for supervisors. The produce safety rule really hones in on 5 components. So we're talking about agricultural water, production and post-harvest, biological soil amendments of animal origin, domesticated and wild animals, worker training, health and hygiene, equipment, tools, building, and sanitation. These are the areas that have the greatest impact on your farm for risk to consumers and have the most proactive steps you can take to reduce risks. I like this visual mainly because, I hope no one in this audience, this is their specific farm with this much risk associated to them. It's more that in this visual, it's quite likely that at least one of these apply to your farm. For instance, even in the south corner where you just have feces from wildlife, every farm has its own unique risk profile depending on topography, for instance, the slope with rain, water, how you irrigate, what's your wildlife profile, is there a concentrated animal feed near you? So what our goal is when we do produce safety in these 5 core points is we just want you to be able to do a risk assessment of your farm, see what's likely to contaminate produce, and then take practical steps to reduce those risks to consumers. So biological soil amendments of animal origin, BSAAOs, they can be a source of contamination if not properly handled and applied. When we're talking about biological soil amendments of animal origin, that's if it comes from an animal in any way, shape, or form. So manures, fish emulsions, chicky doo-doo, feather meal, bone meal, eggshells, you know. So any association to an animal, it falls under this soil amendment of animal origin. If you're going to use untreated BSAAOs, right now the best guidance is adhering to the NOP 90 and 120-day application to harvest interval. So it's 90 days if the commodity grows off the ground and 120 days if it grows on the ground. That is from the minute you incorporate it into the soil until first harvest. If you adhere to those intervals, you're going to significantly reduce the risks. Things to consider when you handle these are improper and incomplete treatment, how do you store and handle, and the risk from runoff, wind spread, and cross-contamination. As far as composting, if you want to consider the amendment treated, it has to be a scientifically valid treatment process. The most common mistake I see there is on farms, they will age or stack manure, wait a year to use it, and think that that is treated. That's not the case. There are actual metrics you would have to reach for time temp turnings in that scenario. On our website, which I'll put in, well, someone can put in the chat or I'll put it in the chat later, we actually have a few compliance guides that walk you through this process. To compost on your farm, it's actually pretty straightforward and simplistic. The mistake people make is not getting the correct number of temperature reads and turnings. Once you do that, it's considered treated, and that 90, 120 day doesn't apply. Watch out for recontamination in your treatment process. And if you're purchasing compost that's treated, request a letter from the seller indicating their composting standards. Agricultural water. So this is any water intended to or likely to contact produce or food contact surfaces. Generally, the easy way to think of it is there's production water, the water used for growing the crops, and then there's your post-harvest water. The thing to think about here is how can you reduce potential contamination from water in your produce operation? So our production water, we're talking irrigation, crop sprays, frost protection, post-harvest, washing, waxing, cleaning, fluming, cooling, and then you have your unexpected events, flooding and runoff. Depending on the source of the water, your risk profiles vary drastically. If you're using a municipal public water source that's treated, it is very low risk. Groundwater falls in the middle there. It depends on a lot of factors, the aquifer, its depth, the wellhead construction, quality, the topography surrounding it. And then you've got surface water, which is the highest risk because it's open to the environment. The first step for having good ag water is just to test your sources. For wells and water right now, K-State, and there's going to be a slide at the end, we're doing the water testing for free. It's basically, if you don't know the quality of your water to start, it makes it hard for us to recommend safe practices for using the ag water. For production water, the standard is recreational water quality. And for post-harvest, we're talking potable, no detectable generic E. coli 100 ml water sample. When you do the testing and you get the numbers, we are able to walk that through with you and help you understand it and any mitigation steps that might be necessary in response. Assessing your delivery method. So the application method, are you using overhead sprinkler irrigation, which you can see on the left, or are you using drip, which you can see on the right? This significantly impacts the risk for microbial contamination. If you're using surface water overhead, that's very high risk versus a well and drip or even surface drip. Now, the one exception there would be if you're doing root crops, then the drip profile, it's still the best way to go, but you do have more direct contact with the produce, so the risk changes a little bit. So that's why we really like to emphasize produce safety really just begins with understanding your farm's risk assessment and profile that's unique and specific to you. Domesticated and wild animals, especially wild animals, the grievance to every farmer outside of weather, pest, and disease. They're a concern besides eating your crop because they can carry and transmit human pathogens to produce. Prevention measures, monitoring, and measures taken if intrusion or possible contamination. So we're talking there a pre-harvest assessment. Never harvest produce if you can visibly see contamination with feces. It is impossible, generally speaking, to completely exclude all wildlife from a farm. That is not our expectation, and it's not realistic. Again, it comes back to knowing what wildlife risk is there to your farm. And once you have identified that risk, how can you mitigate, say you have deer? Do they have a certain migration pattern? Are there deterrents you can put up to prevent them from getting in the fields? Fencing, shock post, lethal measures, there's a ton of options you have as the grower. And what we want from you is to look at your risk assessment, know that wild animals are a part of farming, but our expectation isn't that you will just say wild animals are part of farming. It's knowing your animal population and the steps you're going to take in response to it. Decoys, I've seen some interesting stuff coming out of Arizona where you actually have to move those every 2 hours or wildlife adapts to them. So I am not a huge fan of decoys. Fencing and netting, very, very successful at what they do, but they're pricey. So there's some interesting videos on our website too, where you can go to wildlife management. And for instance, you can get Air Ranger, which is those Gumbies that you see at used car dealerships. I've seen them where they make screamer sounds. They get kind of annoying after a while to the grower. You could put Mylar tape on them, put them near bird populations, and they're a deterrent because they're constantly changing shape. And when the sun hits the Mylar tape, it irritates the birds. So there are options you have for mitigating wildlife. There are specialists in both states who can help you with this. Equipment, tools, and buildings. You'll see a lean-to shed right there. It's doing very good practices. You can see the stuff off the ground, harvest containers, wash basins, all that good stuff. I like these images to show you that it doesn't have to be a high-tech, brand new, state-of-the-art stainless steel facility to be doing good practices. You can see inside a clean storage here, avoiding drip condensate. Those bulbs need to either be shatterproof or covered with a sleeve. Having smooth, cleanable surfaces, all these things go a long way to eliminating and reducing risk to your produce. These are some great pack shed examples of different wash setups. The one in the bottom left, that's going to be hardware cloth. It basically looks like chicken wire. That's a great way you can wash produce because it doesn't collect or pool the water. It's a drain system, so you don't have recirculation risks. Harvest containers and tools. You really want to have washable containers. They're going to be that food grade plastics. They're referred to as RPCs, repackaged containers. You've got collapsible crates, same premise. And same thing with your tools, make sure you're cleaning and sanitizing them. While the sheaths for harvest knives are convenient, they also tend to be leather, very hard to clean. And if they're used throughout the day, that inside can become a contamination source. Cleaning and sanitizing, zone ones are going to be the emphasis. And the easy way to think about that is from the minute of harvest, including the worker's hands, their tools, and the harvest container, to the point it gets to the consumer, everything that produce touches is a zone one. That's what really needs to be cleaned and sanitized. Zone twos, very important because they can be a contributing factor to contamination of produce, but the emphasis out the gate is the zone ones. Washing produce. For some produce, it is better for the producer not to wash. I always encourage the grower, if you can remove water from the equation, it's going to make your life easier and your produce safer. If you do have to wash, so what you see in the bottom left there, that's a dump tank. It's a submersion system. In the middle, 3-bay sink, pretty common for lettuce. And on the right, you've got a single pass wash system, though that's mostly for hydration for those greens. Put it at a higher volume and you have a produce wash. The thing, let me see if the specifics are on the next slide. So we'll get to that. The things with this is, if you incorporate water, so let's take the leafy greens in the middle, for instance. Let's say during harvest, you did not notice that a bird crapped all over the inside of one of the lettuce folds. It's your lucky day that bird was carrying salmonella. Once you introduce that lettuce to that water, if you're not using a sanitizer correctly, what can happen is the water can hit that salmonella and spread it to all the produce. So that's what you see in these large scale outbreaks. And here, the reason we encourage the sanitizer is it's not going to wash or kill or disinfect the one contaminated lettuce head. What it will do is it will prevent that one lettuce head, spinach, greens, whatever you're doing in there, from contaminating the entire basin. The most common mistake I see with 3-bay sinks are people will put a sanitizer only in the middle bay when they're using it. So the problem is, you go back to that start point, the minute you introduce those leafy greens into that first bay, you're now spreading it to all the leafy greens. So then when you put them in the middle bay, remember the sanitizer, it's not going to wash and clean them. It's going to prevent free floaters in the second bay. So then when you then take it and dump it in the third bay, the fresh water rinse, you're doing the same thing. Now you're going to spread the contaminant back into a plain water source. So these are things to think about. And again, I know it can seem a little daunting using sanitizers, but don't hesitate to reach out to us at Extension because it's what we do. Here you can see a nice zoom up of those leafy green characteristics. Those folds can really protect the pathogens. Then you introduce it to the water, no sanitizer, and you get this mass spread event. There's that. In the picture, you'll see a stainless 3-bay sink and a hardware cloth table to the left. Again, that nice thing about that table to the left is you put your produce on there, you rinse it down. There's no risk of cross-contamination from a dump tank. You can remove the sanitizer. If you are going to submerge the produce, there are many organic options, and you can also use chlorine's very effective and very cheap. Remember to clean your surfaces. It's written as when necessary, when appropriate, as needed. Typically, it helps to have an interval for your farm, and then anytime it is needed due to, say, heavy soil or potential contaminant. If you are going to use sanitizers, the mistake people make there is not using them correct. They will have very specific metrics of concentration that you need to hit for it to be effective. Cooling is important for food safety and quality. So strawberries, 1 hour at a field temp of 90 degrees can be up to 1 week at 32 degrees. So since you've grown this great crop, cool it quickly. Your customers will like it better, and it just tends to help your farm. Allow airflow between containers. You want to cool down ASAP, maintain the cold chain, and if possible, shade the vehicle. That right there you can see is a cold cap from the Olathe Horticulture Research Center that they built. Transporting. Clean and sanitize surfaces after transporting non-food contaminants. So if you're using a truck to move manure, livestock, meat, chemicals, and you're going to throw fresh produce back there, get those car wash style large brushes, use Dawn. You got spray bleach that you can use. And if nothing else, you can go buy cheap painter's plastic and use it as a barrier between the truck and the produce. It is beneficial to protect the surfaces with tarps, and especially covering during transport. Personnel. Workers can spread pathogens to produce because obviously they're going to directly handle the fruits and vegetables. Ag is especially specialty crops, very hands-on. And I'll tell you, I see all the time, they'll come out with studies where smartphones are dirtier than public toilets. And watch your workers. It is insane how much we grab our phones throughout the day and then just don't think about it. So little things like that on your farm go a long way to increasing your produce safety. Improper health and hygiene practices. So we're talking a lack of adequate training or hand washing and inadequate toilet facilities. That is just a way to have a nightmare on your farm. If your workers are sick, they really should not be handling produce or food contact surfaces under any circumstance. As the grower, if you have workers or volunteers, you need to train them on this. We put on our website a compliance guide to walk through worker training to make that a simpler process for you. This is a great example, if you look at that picture, of a hand washing station that is very cheap to set up, portable, and is just great for growers. The key thing with those 5-gallon containers, think of a Gatorade bucket. It's got to have a continuous flow spigot. They've got to be able to turn it on, let it run, and then same premise, use the paper towel to dry their hands and then turn off the water. You'll see there is a gray water catch basin and a trash receptacle. You can get those 5-gallon buckets from Home Depot or Lowe's that are $2.50 each, and you've met both right there. Workers and visitors always need access to clean and stocked bathrooms. You always have a hand washing site with running water, soap, and clean towels located near the toilet and break areas, and wash hands for 20 seconds. Post hand washing signs. Anywhere you have a hand washing station, you can get these, laminate them, put them up, and they're just good visual reminders for people to see all the time on proper hand washing. Record keeping, it includes documenting your practices, monitoring, and corrective actions. Pretty much any template you need is already in existence. There are many on our website covering everything you need for a farm operation. Remember, record keeping should be convenient or it won't get done. Another thing too is there's a tendency to farm during the day and then at night do your records. That's a really bad practice. You want to do the record keeping as you're doing the task. If you're going to be covered under inspection or decide to go for an audit, records must be signed and dated after they are reviewed, and keep all records for at least 2 years. A farm food safety plan. This gets you thinking about your farm practices. You can focus time and resources more effectively. It gives you a plan to follow. If you want to do a third-party audit and get GAP certified, it's going to be a requirement, and some buyers require it regardless. It is not required by the FSMA produce safety rule. We offer workshops where I basically provide the template that we used on our farm, and I have customized it to be more reflective of growing in this area. So it's going to give you the base wording that you need, and then we just customize it to your farm. We also go over mapping and all the required templates and all that good stuff. Water sampling. Kansas and Missouri growers, up to 10 free samples. And on our website too, there are videos for how to collect samples and all the forms you need. Those are pretty good too, that Good Fruit. I would just use ours on our website though. And here's just some example procedure that's on the website. It is important when you're collecting water samples to do it aseptically. I'll tell you a true story. I was working with some growers in Missouri, some Amish growers, and they were having bad water tests. And we could not figure out why. And I was doing some site visit. I was looking at their topography, no wildlife, no heavy rains. There was no reason for this water to be coming back poorly. So finally, we're out there, we're just talking one day, and I asked them, I was like, okay, how do you collect the sample? And they proceeded to tell me that they strip down, swim out to the middle of the pond, dip down the bottle, pull it back, come to surface, and submit it for testing. That would not meet aseptic testing metrics. And then when we brought out the stick, pulled the test, the water came back fine. Could have been circumstantial, that it's just there was an event that made the water come back high. But I tell the story to emphasize, collect the sample aseptically and make your life easier to start. For those who want the full day training, that is the FSMA Produce Safety Grower Training. It's through the Produce Safety Alliance. We're going to offer it May 18th and 25th. It's from 1 to 5. You have to attend both days for certification. It is a Good for Life certificate. Registration is up on our website as well. And for anyone who's curious about creating that food safety plan, regardless if they want GAP certification or if they do want GAP certified, we're doing that July 13th from 3 to 5. There is my information on the Kansas side and Patrick's information on the Missouri side. That is the presentation. Let me switch. Are there any questions, things you want to go over, topics you'd like more info on?